If we follow the geopolitical change, and needless to say that these days, the political games are getting more and more complicated. Now, on one hand, in the year of 2025, and we still ask the question, what does that mean to preserve democracy? In a democratic country, at this moment, should everyone, and especially the president, follow the constitutions, or the president is more likely to see himself or herself as the king of the country? Is that okay, or is that even acceptable for the greater future? Now, if we pay closer attention to what's happening in the US today, sitting US President Donald Trump is making noises from the left to the right. And not only that, recently this broke up between Elon Musk and Donald Trump made the news headline, but also citizens around the world it's very much concerned about Donald Trump's trade wars, not only with China, but also with more countries. How should we understand from the constitutional perspective? And does that mean that Donald Trump has the air quote freedom to do anything that he likes? And in this episode, we're going to talk about all of them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is a Professor Ilya Somin. Professor Somin is a law professor at George Mason University and the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. He's the author of the amazing book called Free to Move: Foot Voting, Migration, and the Political Freedom. Well, Professor Somin, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, Professor Somin, before we talk about your book, I want to get started our conversation based on your latest article, which is called A Victory for Separation of Powers. Now, let's talk about Donald Trump at this moment. In the article, this is something that you wrote, actually is part of the title of the article, and I quote, "The president is no king, and he does not have the power to impose taxes in the form of tariffs whenever he feels like it." Professor Somin, there's no surprise that Donald Trump is the believer of tariffs. And we've seen that lately, not only this back and forth between US and China, and also throughout the Trump administration, that he put deadlines to all the countries when we talk about the trade war. Why do you think that today someone like Donald Trump continue to see himself as the king of the country instead of following the constitutional order? What do you say to that?
Well, our Constitution gives to Congress the power to impose tariffs, not to the president. So he can't do it without clear congressional authorization, which simply doesn't exist in this case. As to why he believes that he can, that may be a question better put to him than to me. But I think he's always had something of an authoritarian mindset. And in addition, a lot of even more ordinary presidents have abused their powers in various ways and tried to use fake emergencies to claim more power than they really have. So here Trump is both following his own psychological instincts and trying to build on precedents by previous presidents. But ultimately, he's going way beyond any possible precedent. And he's also violating the Constitution and trying to wield a power that the law simply doesn't give him.
Well, Professor Somin, let's keep our conversation going, because this is not the first time that we've seen Trump use the tariff as the way to protect America, or so-called make America great again. But there are so many countries, and particularly, for example, we're talking about China, it's also responding harshly towards the trade war. But I think from the fundamental perspective, most of us, we still don't really understand what does the word tariff mean today. I mean, again, we understand it's the word tax, and we understand that it's more about economic concerns, or, to balance this economic relationship. But from your perspective, what is the real definition, or how should we understand the definition of tariffs when we look at this trade policy? Well, especially when we look at this competition between China and US, or US with the rest of the world. What do you say to that?
So the definition is easy enough. It hasn't really changed in hundreds of years. The basic idea is that when some good enters the United States from another country, then a tax is imposed of some percentage of the value of the good. In the case of Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs, he has imposed 10% tariffs on imports from almost every country in the world, then additional so-called reciprocity tariffs that vary somewhat for about 57 countries. And then there's also a special additional set of tariffs from Mexico, Canada, and yes, China. And in combination, this has launched the biggest trade war since the Great Depression and made the overall U.S. tariff schedule higher than it's been in a century or more. So while tariffs as such are not new, what is new, at least new for a long time, is a trade war on this enormous scale. And one can argue about the U.S.-China relationship and the competition between those two countries. But even if you want to argue that there's some special argument for tariffing China because they're a dangerous competitor, tariffing virtually the entire rest of the world is still stupid and destructive, and indeed harmful to our efforts to counter China, because by damaging relations with our allies, we're weakening ourselves relative to China in fairly obvious ways.
But Professor Somin, how should we analyze the reaction from China at this moment? I mean, again, as before we taped the show, that the breaking news came out that yesterday, or should we say 24 hours ago, that President Trump actually had a phone call with the Chinese president and regarding the trade war and also regarding the tension between the two countries. Again, as we mentioned before, China has been actively running on what we called a warfare diplomacy. And of course that we know the current Chinese administration is no stranger to Donald Trump. And this is, again, as we mentioned before, this is not the first time that Donald Trump dealt with China, and especially in this harsh tone or in this critical way. But meanwhile, China has not backed down from Trump's trade war and also has not, responded positively towards Trump. But meanwhile, in the article, you also pointed out that because of the economic situation, because the ongoing competition in between US and China, that could actually hurt so many businesses, and especially when we talk about the US businesses, and also we talk about the raised prices on the consumers for our country. So how should we understand the reaction from China at this moment? And why do you think that Donald Trump continue to run on this principle without realizing that this is not actually working effectively as he planned? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so obviously I don't know for sure what they're thinking in Beijing. They don't consult me on their policies, but I would say that they seem to have a dual attitude. On the one hand, they're obviously not happy that Trump has imposed tariffs on them. On the other hand, they have to be extremely happy that Trump's tariff system is damaging the U.S. economy and damaging our relationships with our allies. And that, of course, furthers their agenda of trying to supplant the U.S. as the dominant power in the world and spread their authoritarian values. And so on. So it's because of this damage to the U.S. economy and alliance system that it seems like they're feeling confident in Beijing right now. And if we want to counter them, and we should, at the very least, we should stop the trade war with our allies. We should stop dumping on liberal values generally. We should stop immigration restrictions on people fleeing the tyranny of China and Russia and other authoritarian states, because those immigration restrictions also weaken our economy and also strengthen China and other enemies relative to us. We can argue about the extent to which maybe there should be some trade restrictions on China, though even there I think Trump has done way more than can possibly be justified. But waging a trade war on the entire rest of the world is just plain stupid and counterproductive, both from the standpoint of strengthening American power and from the standpoint of improving our economy. As to why Trump is still doing what he's doing and why he doesn't realize this, I think he, and sadly many of the people around him, are economically illiterate. They don't understand the basic economics of trade. They believe the trade is a kind of zero-sum game where, if we import more from a country than we export to them, we're somehow losing or they're somehow taking advantage of us. Whereas in reality, that's just not true, as almost any mainstream economist can tell you. I have a big trade deficit with my local supermarket. I have to admit, they virtually never buy anything from me, whereas I buy a lot from them. But that doesn't mean it's some kind of a problem or a threat. It just means that I value the things I buy from them more than I value the money. And moreover, it makes sense from an efficiency point of view and other points of view, that, I buy most of my food from the supermarket and other suppliers rather than trying to create a farm in my backyard or having my own herd of cattle to make my own hamburgers or something like that. And similarly, there are some things that Canada or Europe or Mexico or Japan or whatnot can produce more cheaper and more efficiently than we can. And it makes sense for us to import those things rather than make ourselves poorer and less efficient by trying to produce everything ourselves. So if we want to effectively counter China, and if we want to have a strong U.S. economy, we should have free trade with as much of the world as possible. We should have strong relationships with our liberal democratic allies, and we should stop shooting ourselves in the foot, which is what Trump is doing right now, and which has to make people in Beijing happy, even if they're not happy about the part which involves tariffs on China specifically.
Professor Somin, I have one more question I want to ask you before we talk about your amazing book. In the article, this is something that you wrote, and I quote, "Americans across the political spectrum have an interest in preventing the president from wielding monarchical powers, undermining the Constitution, and starting ruinous trade wars," end quote. There's no surprise that Constitution is one of the fundamental principles or fundamental documents for our country. I mean, again, regardless if you're what political party that you belong to, and again, there's no denying that every single person should abide the law according to the Constitution. Now, at this moment, how important it is not only for the president but also for the entire society to understand the power of Constitution. And why do you think that people like Donald Trump or people surrounding Donald Trump continue to undermine the Constitution? And again, how does that will impact our constitutional rights and also the image of the United States on this international stage? Your thoughts?
Yeah, so all good questions. Ultimately, what separates us from China or Russia or other authoritarian states is not that we're somehow smarter than they are or, morally better people or whatnot. It's that we have limits on the powers of our government. We have rights that they have to respect, and we don't concentrate all or nearly all power in the hands of one person like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or some other dictator of that sort. And those principles are deeply rooted in our constitutional tradition and even in the British tradition, which came before and influenced ours. The British overthrew King Charles I in part because he tried to impose taxes on the country without the authorization of Parliament, and the British concluded that is a power that no one man, not even a king, should have. And the same principle applies here. There's a reason why the Constitution gives the power of taxation and the power to impose tariffs to Congress. It doesn't let one man, the president, have that power, is because they saw what happened with Charles I and other authoritarian and monarchical rulers in Europe. They didn't like that. They didn't want the same sort of problem to be repeated here. And so if we do allow our president to act like a king and to promote authoritarian values, then ultimately we're not much better than the Russians or the Chinese or other authoritarian rulers. And we weaken ourselves, because we create a political and economic system which is flawed and dysfunctional and has the same kinds of problems that the Russians and Chinese and others have. And obviously we damage our position on the international stage because we lose the idea ideas of liberty and democracy and limited government power that have inspired people around the world, including even my parents. I'm originally from Russia, then the Soviet Union. My parents came here because this country is freer and has more limits on government power than the Soviet Union did or other authoritarian and totalitarian states around the world. If we lose that, it's bad for our position in the world, it's bad for Americans at home, and it would be a catastrophe all around. As to why Donald Trump doesn't value this and feels otherwise, again, ultimately that's more a question for him than for me, but I think he's always had a kind of authoritarian mindset. He has at times expressed that admiration for dictators like Vladimir Putin or even the rulers of China. Even as far back as 1989, he seemed to praise the Tiananmen Square massacre, which occurred that year. So he has that mindset. Fortunately, we still do have some constraints on government power. We have courts, we have other institutions, and we have to use them as much as possible to prevent him from acting on his authoritarian instincts. The problem he poses is not a new one. It goes centuries back to the origins of our constitutional system, and hopefully this system can weather the current crisis just as it has weathered others during our history.
Well, Professor, let's talk about your amazing book, which is called Free to Move, Foot Voting, Migration, and the Political Freedom. I want to talk about the concept of political freedom at this moment. And we know that today, when we look at the political reform or the political transformation around the world, for example, the countries in the Middle East, Iran and Syria, and all the way countries in Asia, we talk about China, we talk about, countries in Southeast Asia. Every single country, it seemed undergoing this political transformation. But again, Professor, as you mentioned before, in our country, that when we enjoy or when we protect the value of political freedom, and this is something it's irreplaceable. But from your perspective, Professor Somin, what is the definition of political freedom in our country at this moment, and how does that relate it to what you called foot voting or even to the right of vote? And we know that vote is the best representation to change the country. Every single American citizen is granted to vote, to participate in a political movement. So what is the connection between political freedom and the voting at this moment? And why is that still so indispensable for our country today?
Sure. So political freedom, at least as I define it, is simply the ability to choose what government policies you're going to live under as opposed to having them imposed by an authoritarian ruler or a king or an oligarchy or whatnot. And obviously, for most people, the traditional view is that political freedom, we just have it at the ballot box. Every 4 years we elect the president, every 2 years we elect members of Congress and so on. And I don't deny that there is an element of political freedom there. It's certainly better than authoritarianism, but there are two major problems which I think expanding the ability to vote with your feet can address. One is that when you vote at the ballot box, the chance that your vote will make a decisive difference, the outcome, and therefore it's the policies that you live under, is generally infinitesimally small. In an American presidential election, it's about a 1 in 60 million chance that your one vote will make a difference. It varies somewhat by the state you're in, but that's roughly the average. In state or local elections, it's somewhat higher, but still very low. So it seems like it's not that meaningful a choice if it only has a tiny chance of making a difference. The second problem is one that flows directly from the first. When your choice has so little chance of making a difference, it incentivizes you to spend little or no time learning about the issues at stake. You are what economists call rationally ignorant. It's not rational for most people to spend more than the minimum amount of time learning about the issues they're voting on in an election, because even if they do learn about them, the chance their knowledge will make a difference is extremely small. And in fact, as I discuss in my other book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, it turns out that overwhelmingly most voters most of the time know very little about the issues that they're voting on. So with just traditional ballot box voting, you have two problems. One is there's very little chance that your vote will make a difference. And second, closely related, there's the problem of ignorance. Now, on the other hand, take voting with your feet, which is the ability, for instance, to choose which policies you're living under, say by choosing which jurisdiction you want to live in a federal system, like what state or local government, or through international migration, choosing which country you want to live in, or by the third method, often there are private sector organizations that can provide services such as education or security or others that are traditionally provided by government. And there you can vote with your feet and make choices, often even without physically moving. There, when you make those choices by voting with your feet, by any of those three methods, first of all, it's a choice that if you're allowed to make it, it has a high chance of making a difference. Second, it is likely to be a better informed choice. If you're like most people, you probably spend more time seeking out information when you decide what smartphone to get or what television set to get than we decide who to vote for president or any other political office. That's not because the television set is more important than who holds the presidency or deals with more complicated issues. It's because when you choose a TV, you know it's the one that's actually going to end up in your living room. And that choice will make a difference. When you turn on the TV and you have the misfortune to see the president or some other powerful politician, the chance you can influence who that is or what policies they pursue is very, very small. So most people spend much less time learning about that. So in my book, I explain how we can expand opportunities for people to vote with their feet, both within countries, such as within the US federal system, and internationally through international migration. And I also address a variety of possible objections.
Well, Professor Somin, I have two more questions before letting you go. Now, let's talk about one thing that you mentioned uniquely. It's about the political message and through the lens of media. And of course, that you're the expert. And now, when we talk about the political message through the lens of media, one thing came to our mind is the first televised the presidential debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. I remember historically speaking, of course, that I will say I'm a bit younger than that period, but anyway, I remember that throughout the courses and even again as a journalist, that when we talk about the first time that people watch this heated debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, and that was just mesmerizing. On one hand, people were seeing this young candidate, John F. Kennedy, was competing or was trying to outshine Richard Nixon. But now fast forward to what's happening today. Professor, from your perspective, how important it is for the political candidates, or even though today, right now, we'll continue to see the political race across the country, how important it is for candidates to get the message loud and clear to the voters. I mean, ultimately, again, we know that every single vote matters, but it's more important to let the politicians or let the candidates understand that the voters really matter, and also their messages has to be understood and appreciated by the voters or by the citizens. So how important or significant for a candidate to present themselves well and also to make the message clear and easier to understand, and most importantly, to build this connection with the audience. Your thoughts?
So certainly a candidate who has a connection with voters, with the audience, on average has a better chance of winning than one that doesn't. But I think the dynamic of political ignorance that I mentioned earlier plays a role here. A couple years ago, I looked back and actually watched those Nixon-Kennedy debates, and I'm a bit older than you, but yes, those debates were certainly before my time. One thing that I was struck by was that debate was actually much more substantive than more modern presidential debates are, because over time, the candidates have learned and their advisors have learned that most voters are ignorant and know very little about most issues. And therefore, if you want to reach them, you have to speak in sort of crude sound bites. Whereas Nixon and Kennedy, obviously, to some extent, they were doing that too, but they were going into more depth on a lot of issues than typically candidates do today, because the dynamics of political ignorance weren't quite as fully understood by campaign advisors perhaps back in 1960 as is the case today. So yes, as a matter of political strategy, it's very important for candidates to effectively reach voters, but unfortunately much of the time what that involves is exploiting people's ignorance by engaging in crude sound bites and misleading statements and the like. And that has always been a problem in politics, going back all the way to ancient times, in the origins of democracy in ancient Greece and Rome. But in some ways, it's even worse today as candidates and advisors and campaign strategists have become more sophisticated at doing this. And also government is larger and more complicated. So there's even more for voters to misunderstand or be ignorant about. And of course, with modern technology, there's a lot more media out there and a lot more forms of entertainment out there, which generally speaking is good. I like that entertainment myself, the same as the next guy, but it also means the political information is competing out there with even more other things than used to be the case in the past. And that gives politicians even more incentive to exploit ignorance and use crude sound bites as opposed to exploring the issues in greater depth. Those listening to this, don't take my word for it. Go watch one of the Nixon-Kennedy debates. You can find them on YouTube for free. Compare it to one of the debates between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump last year, and you will see a significant difference in sort of the degree of sophistication of the arguments that are being made by the candidates in that election compared to the more recent one.
Well, Professor Somin, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, your book is called Free to Move: Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. There's no denying that today we're continued seeing this political polarization around the world. I mean, again, it's something that's tragically, to say, unavoidable. Look at this political uncertainty. Now, you mentioned a term called international migration. So I want to ask you the last question. How does international migration link to political polarization today? I mean, especially we're seeing that people are fleeing or leaving their countries and then moving to one to another, but that could basically impact the political change or also the political messages. So again, briefly from your perspective, what is the correlation between international migration to political polarization today? And is there anything that we can do to avoid political polarization? Your final thoughts.
Yeah, so really there's sort of two questions. One, how does international migration relate to polarization? The other is, how can we reduce polarization? Both of those are sort of big issues that I can't fully address in the next minute or two, but I'll give you some basic thoughts. And in my book and in some other writings, I have more to say. First, how can we reduce polarization? There's no one surefire method, but one way is actually to decentralize government power and increase people's opportunity to vote with their feet. If less of our lives was dominated by the federal government in Washington, D.C., or by other central governments in other countries, if we had more opportunity to vote with our feet by making decisions in the private sector or by choosing what state or local government we live under, we would have less reason to fear the opposing political party being in power in Washington, because even if the worst happens and that party is in power, they would have control over many fewer issues than is the case now. So decentralizing power and expanding foot voting can help mitigate political polarization. It can't eliminate it entirely, I admit that, but it can reduce the dangers at the margin. Second, is immigration contributing to polarization? To some extent, it likely is, because what we see in the United States and also in many European countries is in fact political conflict over migration, obviously with Donald Trump being a big migration restrictionist in the US, but also similar political forces in many countries in Europe. However, the cause of that is not so much supposedly excessive migration. Polls show that most voters have very little idea of how much migration there actually is. And you see anti-immigrant political movements, even in countries like Hungary, where there's very little actual immigration, but nonetheless unless Viktor Orban came to power opposing it. Rather, I think what is causing this backlash is a couple of things. One is a sense that there is disorder at the border, like at the southern border in the United States in recent years, and in some places in Europe as well. The other is a very wrong-headed sense that immigration is somehow a zero-sum game, that if immigrants are doing well, then that means there's fewer jobs, fewer opportunities, fewer resources for native-born Americans or native-born Frenchmen or Germans, and so on. On the first problem, with disorder at the border, it is largely caused by immigration restrictions themselves, because when the vast majority of people who might want to migrate to seek greater freedom and opportunity cannot do so, what we've done is effectively created a vast black market, which causes disorder and smuggling and the like, and illegal migration. Just like when we had alcohol prohibition 100 years ago, that caused a vast black market in alcohol and did cause disorder and crime, like with Al Capone and others, who were, evading prohibition. So the way to deal with that is just as ending alcohol prohibition largely put an end to that disorder. Similarly, making legal migration easier can put an end or at least greatly reduce disorder at the border. On the other issue, I think it's valuable if more people could realize that actually immigration is not a zero-sum game. It's economically beneficial. Immigrants contribute disproportionately to entrepreneurship, to innovation, to advances in medical fields and science. I think I may be wrong, but you may be an immigrant from China, or perhaps your parents were, and Chinese immigrants have contributed massively to the growth of American science, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And the same is true from those from many other countries. And we would be worse off if we had less of that. Indeed, economists estimate that if we had free migration throughout the world GDP would double. That is, the world would be twice as productive as it currently is, because many millions of people could move to places where they could be more productive and more innovative, and that would benefit not just them, but also the natives of receiving countries. I have much more to say about this in my book, and also in other publications, such as my recent article, Immigration and the Economic Freedom of Natives. And if you're interested, you can viewers can check out those materials.
Absolutely, Professor. Again, at this moment, we don't know whether Donald Trump will continue to put more tariffs on the countries around the world. But again, as we mentioned before, for our country, Constitution is one of the most important and fundamental documents. It's a guiding principle for everyone. Again, it's such a great conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to have Professor Ilya Somin. Again, Professor Somin is a law professor at George Mason University and the B. Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online and check out Professor Somin's amazing book, which is called Free to Move: Foot Voting, Migration, and the Political Freedom. Well, Professor Somin, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would love to have you back on the show as we continue to discover those amazing topics. So thank you so much for doing this.